15 forgotten Depression-era meals old people grew up eating. In 1932, in a farmhouse outside Tulsa, Oklahoma, a woman named Edna made dinner from what she had. What she had was a heel of cornbread from the morning, 3 potatoes that were beginning to soften at the eyes, a jar of bacon drippings she kept on the back of the stove, and a pot of water she had carried from the well before the sun got too high to make the walk comfortable. She made dinner. She fed 5 children and a husband who had not found work in 14 months. She washed the pot afterward and set it back on the stove for tomorrow. She did this every day for 7 years. The Great Depression lasted from 1929 to approximately 1939 in the United States, though for the rural poor, the tenant farmers, the sharecroppers, the Dust Bowl families who lost their land and their topsoil and their futures simultaneously, the economic collapse merely formalized a poverty that had existed before the crash and would persist long after the recovery. Statistics said the emergency was over. At the Depression's worst point in 1933, 1 in 4 American workers was unemployed. In certain regions and communities, the figure was higher. In certain households, the arithmetic of food, how to make what existed feed the number of people who needed feeding, consumed the majority of a woman's daily mental and physical energy. The meals that resulted from that arithmetic have largely disappeared. Not because they were bad, not because they failed to do what they were made to do. They disappeared because the generation that made them raised children who associated the food with the hardship, who made the reasonable human decision when prosperity arrived to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the meals that had marked the worst years. The children of Depression-era mothers grew up to buy white bread and canned goods and eventually frozen dinners, and the recipes that had kept their families alive lived in their mother's hands and not any cookbook, and went quiet when those hands went still. Number 12 on this list was made from a part of the vegetable that every modern cook discards without looking at it. Number 8 was the meal that farm families across the Midwest called by a name that made it sound like more than it was, which was the point. Number 4 required a technique so specific to the conditions of a wood-burning stove that it cannot be accurately reproduced on a modern range, and the women who knew exactly how to manage that technique are gone. Number 2 was eaten by more Americans during the 1930s than any other single meal, and has been so completely forgotten that most people under 60 have never heard its name. These 15 meals are the real food of the American Depression. Not the romanticized version, not the farm-to-table retrospective. The food that people actually made when the money was gone and the stores were empty and the family was at the table waiting for whatever the kitchen could produce. Number 15. Cornmeal mush. Begin here, because this is where the story of Depression-era American cooking begins, with cornmeal, which was cheap, which lasted, which could be stretched in ways that more expensive grains could not, and which formed the caloric foundation of the rural poor's diet across the American South and Midwest for a period considerably longer than the Depression itself. Cornmeal mush was made by pouring coarse yellow cornmeal into boiling salted water, roughly 1 part meal to 4 parts water, and stirring continuously over medium heat for 20 to 30 minutes until the mixture thickened from liquid to something that held the spoon's mark and pulled away from the sides of the pot. The process required attention. Cornmeal mush scorched against an unwatched pot with the enthusiasm of something that had been waiting for the opportunity. It required the kind of continuous engagement that the Depression-era kitchen demanded of the woman managing it. Not the distracted multitasking of contemporary cooking, but the focused physical presence of someone who understood that wasted food had a cost that could not be absorbed. Eaten hot from the pot with a drizzle of molasses or a spoonful of bacon drippings, cornmeal mush was dinner. Poured into a pan and allowed to cool and set overnight, sliced into rectangles and fried in a skillet with whatever fat was available the next morning, the same mush became breakfast. A completely different texture, crisp at the exterior and dense at the center, possessed of a character that the soft original never suggested. 1 preparation, 2 meals. The arithmetic that Depression cooking required applied to a single pot of cornmeal and water. Rural families across Appalachia, the Deep South, and the Ozarks ate cornmeal mush with a frequency through the 1930s that cannot be accurately conveyed by any contemporary analogy. It was not a meal among meals. It was the meal, the default to which the kitchen returned when every other option had been exhausted or exceeded the budget. The families that ate it every day for years did not eat it because they loved it. They ate it because it was there and because it was enough, and because being enough was the only criterion that mattered. Number 14, potato soup with milk. There are exactly 4 ingredients in this soup, and nothing about any of them suggests that together they could constitute the primary meal of a family navigating the worst economic disaster in American history. Potatoes, milk, salt, and whatever fat was available, bacon drippings or lard, or occasionally butter if the cow was still producing and the butter could not be sold for more than it was worth to keep. That is the complete recipe. The technique is what made it a meal rather than a description of poverty. The potatoes, as many as the household possessed, because the more potatoes in the pot, the more substantial the soup, were peeled and cubed and simmered in a minimum of salted water until just tender. The water was not drained. It was kept in the pot along with the starchy potato cubes because the starch that had leached into the cooking liquid during simmering would thicken the soup when the milk was added, and the heat was reduced to the low simmer that prevented the milk from breaking and making the soup grainy and wrong. The milk went in slowly. The fat went in at the end. The soup was eaten with whatever bread existed, cornbread if cornmeal was available, baking powder biscuits if the flour and leavening held out, plain crackers if neither did. The milk in this soup was not purchased milk from a store. It was, in farmhouse kitchens, milk from the family cow, which meant that the soup could only be made when the cow was producing, which meant that potato soup with milk was a marker of a certain level of rural resource rather than an indicator of absolute poverty. Families without a cow substituted water for the milk and produced something thinner and less nourishing that they called the same thing, because naming it differently would have required acknowledging a distinction that nobody wanted to articulate. The soup fed large families from a few potatoes and a cup of milk by applying heat and time and the starchy thickening of the potato itself. It asked almost nothing in terms of ingredients and everything in terms of the patience required to manage the heat carefully enough to keep the milk from breaking. The women who made it daily knew the precise moment when the heat had to drop, felt it in the steam rising from the pot before the milk began to granulate, read it in the way the surface changed from smooth to slightly textured. The knowledge lived in the body before it lived anywhere else. Number 13, bean soup with ham hock. Ham hocks were the cheapest cut at the butcher during the Depression. The smoked, rough-skinned joint of the pig's lower leg that contained more bone and collagen than meat, and that the butcher sometimes sold for pennies or traded for whatever the farm family had brought to town in exchange. The meat on a ham hock was minimal and required hours of simmering before it released from the bone into the pot. This was not a disadvantage in a kitchen where the wood-burning stove was going all day, and the time required to make something edible was not measured against more valuable alternative uses of the hours. Dried beans, navy beans, pinto beans, great northern beans, depending on the region, were soaked overnight and then simmered with the ham hock in enough water to cover by several inches. They cooked together for 3 to 4 hours until the beans had softened completely and begun to break down at their edges and thicken the surrounding liquid, until the collagen from the ham hock had dissolved into the broth and given it a body that pure bean soup never achieved, until the smoke of the cured hock had permeated everything in the pot with a depth of flavor that made the minimal actual meat irrelevant. By the time the soup was done, the hock had given everything it contained to the liquid and the beans around it. The small amount of meat that could be pulled from the bone went back into the pot. The bone went to the dog or was cracked for its marrow, depending on the family's particular relationship with waste. The soup, dark, thick, smoky, deeply savory, was ladled over cornbread or eaten with whatever bread existed, and constituted a meal that was, by the nutritional evidence, more complete than it looked. Depression-era families in the South and Midwest ate bean soup with ham hock weekly at minimum and often more frequently. Church cookbooks from the 1930s record it as the single most common recipe submitted by their congregations, not because it was aspirational, but because it was universal. Every family had the recipe because every family had needed the recipe for the same reasons. Number 12, potato peel soup. Here is the dish made from what every modern cook discards without looking at it. Potato peels, the thin skin removed from potatoes before they were boiled or mashed or added to soup, were not discarded in Depression-era kitchens. They were the raw material for a soup that required nothing beyond the peels themselves, water, salt, and whatever fat was available to fry the peels in before the water was added. The technique was specific and important. Potato peels fried briefly in bacon drippings or lard until they began to color at the edges developed a depth of flavor that boiled peels never produced. The starch on the surface caramelizing against the hot fat, the skin itself developing a toasty character that made the subsequent soup taste of something deliberately made rather than accidentally assembled from waste material. Water was added to the fried peels. The pot was brought to a boil and then reduced to a simmer, and the peels were cooked until they had given everything they contained to the broth. The broth was strained. The peels, having surrendered their starch and their flavor to the liquid, were discarded. What remained was a thin, golden, surprisingly complex soup that tasted of potato without containing any potato, the essence extracted and the material removed, a technique of concentration that produced something from nothing with the thoroughness that Depression-era cooking required. Seasoned with salt and whatever herbs grew in the kitchen garden, parsley, thyme, whatever survived the season, potato peel soup was served to children who were not told what it was made from. Not from shame, exactly. From the practical understanding that children who knew they were eating potato peels would experience the information as poverty rather than as dinner, and that experiencing dinner as poverty was a form of damage that a careful mother could prevent with the management of a single piece of information. The management of that information, the daily work of presenting scarcity as sufficiency, of framing the absolutely minimal as adequately nourishing, of protecting children from the full weight of the family's circumstances through the ordinary act of putting something in front of them and calling it dinner, was as much a part of Depression-era motherhood as the cooking itself. Number 11, fried cornmeal cakes. Cornmeal, water, salt, fat. These four ingredients in the hands of a woman who understood what heat could do to them, and in what sequence produced something that fed a family for almost nothing, and that the family, through the alchemy of hunger and warmth and the specific pleasure of something crisp from a hot skillet, ate with genuine appetite rather than mere compliance. Cornmeal cakes were made by combining coarse cornmeal with enough hot water to produce a thick batter that held its shape when dropped from a spoon, thicker than pancake batter, looser than dough, somewhere in the territory that required judgment to calibrate correctly, and that the women who made them daily calibrated by feel rather than by measure. A well-seasoned cast iron skillet heated over the wood stove until a drop of water sizzled and evaporated immediately. A spoonful of bacon dripping spread across the surface. The batter dropped by spoonfuls into the hot fat, each cake spreading slightly before the heat set the edges. 3 to 4 minutes per side produced cakes that were crisp and brown at the exterior and dense and slightly grainy at the center. The texture of cornmeal that has been cooked through but not had the time or liquid to become soft in the way of cornmeal mush. Eaten with molasses or with the pot liquor from whatever greens had been cooked earlier, fried cornmeal cakes were the bread that cost nothing when bread flour was beyond reach. The cast iron skillet that produced them was the most important piece of equipment in the Depression-era kitchen, seasoned over years of use into a surface that required almost no fat to prevent sticking, that distributed heat with an evenness that no modern pan replicates, that moved from the stove top to the oven to the table without changing its character. The women who knew exactly how to use that skillet produced something that justified the learning. The women who did not burn the cakes and wasted the cornmeal went back to the mush. Number 10, milk toast. Milk toast. Milk toast sounds like something served to invalids, which is in fact one of the contexts in which it appears most frequently in the cookbook literature of the 19th and early 20th centuries. But its Depression-era incarnation was not invalid food. It was dinner, made by and for people whose circumstances had temporarily placed them in the category of those who ate the food of people without resources. Stale bread, and in the Depression-era kitchen, bread was allowed to go stale as a matter of practical management because stale bread was still food and fresh bread was a luxury, was toasted in the oven or directly on the stovetop until it dried further and developed color at the edges and on the surface. The toast went into a bowl. Hot milk, scalded in a saucepan with a pinch of salt and a scraping of butter if the butter existed, was poured over the toast until the bread began to soften and absorb the milk, and the bowl filled with something warm and slightly thick and possessed of the specific comfort of dairy fat against a hungry stomach. Children ate it eagerly because it was warm and sweet in the way that milk is sweet, and because it occupied the bowl convincingly, and because they did not yet know enough about the economics of their household to understand that dinner should contain more than bread and milk. Adults ate it without comment because commenting would have required acknowledging what it signified. The silence around the Depression-era table was often the silence of people who understood exactly what they were eating and had collectively agreed not to say so. Milk toast sustained families through evenings when nothing else was available and produced nothing more dramatic than survival, which was, in those years, the only outcome required of dinner. Number 9. Dandelion green salad with hot bacon dressing. In the spring, when the kitchen gardens had not yet produced and the root cellar was at its emptiest and the family's preserved food had been stretched to the final jars, the fields and roadside ditches of rural America produced an abundance that cost nothing to gather, and that the generation which gathered it understood as food with the same naturalness that their grandchildren would understand supermarket produce. Dandelion greens, the young leaves of the common dandelion, gathered before the plant flowered when the leaves were at their least bitter and most nutritious, were the first fresh vegetable of the Depression-era year. Gathered in quantity by children sent to the fields with baskets, washed in cold water, and dressed with a hot dressing made from bacon drippings and vinegar and a small amount of sugar poured sizzling from the pan directly over the leaves, dandelion salad with hot bacon dressing was the spring meal that the family had been waiting for through the long months of stored food and dried food, and the particular monotony of eating the same preserved things in the same order as the cellar emptied from the bottom up. The hot dressing wilted the greens slightly, softening their bitterness and integrating them with the smokiness of the bacon fat and the sharpness of the vinegar into something that tasted complex rather than simple, alive rather than preserved. The contrast between the hot dressing and the cool greens produced a textural experience that nothing in the winter kitchen had offered for months. Families ate dandelion green salad in spring with an enthusiasm that the meal's nutritional reality justified. Dandelion greens contain more beta-carotene than carrots, more calcium than milk, more iron than spinach, and a suite of vitamins that a winter diet of cornmeal mush and bean soup and dried provisions had depleted, and that the first spring greens restored. They did not know these things about what they were eating. They knew they felt better in April than they had in February, and they associated the improvement with the return of fresh food, and they went back to the fields with the baskets. Number 8, mulligan stew. Here's the meal that farm families across the Midwest and hobos across the entire country called by a name that made it sound like more than it was, which was the point, and which is why the name has survived even as the meal itself has been forgotten. Mulligan stew was not a recipe. It was a principle. Everything available goes into the pot with water and whatever seasoning exists. Potatoes, if there were potatoes. Carrots, if the garden had produced carrots. An onion, there was almost always an onion, onions being the most economical flavoring agent available, and the Depression-era kitchen's most reliable tool for making plain things taste of something. A bone from a previous meal, cracked and added for whatever gelatin and marrow it still contained. dried beans if the overnight soak had been anticipated, a can of tomatoes if the canning season had been productive and the cellar still held a jar. Anything, everything. Nothing wasted. Nothing excluded if it was edible. The hobos who made mulligan stew in camps along railroad lines made it communally, each man contributing whatever he had managed to acquire in the preceding days, the collective pot producing something greater than any individual contribution. The name came from this tradition of collective assembly, the Irish surname a gesture toward the immigrant communities that had developed the practice, and the stew that resulted from it. Farm families made it alone, in kitchens rather than camps, from the week's accumulation of slightly too small, or slightly too old, or slightly too miscellaneous, to use otherwise ingredients that had been collecting in the cold box or the root cellar, waiting for the moment when there were enough of them to justify the pot. The mulligan stew made on Friday night used everything that had not been used earlier in the week and produced a meal that was, depending on what the week had provided, either surprisingly good or predictably adequate, both of which were acceptable outcomes in a kitchen where the alternative was throwing something away, which was not an alternative at all.